Hey everybody, my name is Derek. Welcome to the Art Block. I will be your host once again. In this week's episode, I'm going to talk to you about the late night talk show and how it fits into the entire world of movie marketing. Now, I have always loved the entire format of late night shows. As you can see by my Conan mug here, and I've talked about Conan before on the show. I'm a big fan. I've been a fan since childhood. I rediscovered my love of his show in recent years, and I just always loved late night. I initially started watching The Tonight Show with Jay Leno, and greatly enjoyed that. And that, of course, led me into Conan, who is my favorite of all time, certainly. I watched Last Call with Carson Daly, which is a very different type of talk show, but that show introduced me to so many different artists and indie musicians and all sorts of art and cultural things that are pretty obscure and I wouldn't have known about otherwise. Jimmy Kimmel Live has had some great moments over the years. I loved Craig Ferguson. Late Night with Seth Meyers. In those first years, I watched quite a bit of that. I loved that show at the beginning as well. And Jimmy Fallon. Like when Jimmy Fallon had his late night show and he took over for Conan, I was watching every episode of that. I was loving it. I would record it on a VHS tape and I would watch it over again. I loved that whole format. I haven't watched nearly as much of David Letterman as many have, but I respect him as well. I mean, he was great at what he did too. I just love the late night format, and that's why it's so hard to watch how far it's fallen. I mentioned Jimmy Kimmel Live a minute ago. And a couple of years ago, I really missed that whole late night format. I missed watching a show like that, every night. And so I tried to watch Jimmy Kimmel Live, the new episodes, and I watched a few and enjoyed parts of it and stuff, but it's so hard to get into that like I did before, and there's many reasons for that, of course. It's so easy to point to the political, but I think that's a big thing where the comedy just isn't there anymore. It's been replaced by politics, where in the monologue you're not even hearing jokes about certain politicians. You're hearing their opinions and hearing the daily news from MSNBC repackaged as like a stand-up comedy monologue. You know, that's the thing. When you watch a show, you know everything they're gonna say before they say it. And it's the same thing every night. And Stephen Colbert is a great example because that he's kind of the most, he's the biggest offender in that way. And I grew up watching the Colbert Report, which is an incredible show. Even if you go back and watch clips from it today, which are harder to find than ever, by the way. But if you go back and watch that show today, it is brilliant, brilliant comedy, like without a doubt. And his show now is lacking any sort of spark, in my opinion. And really the only person who has kind of come out of this unscathed is really Conan. Because Conan did his show for years on NBC, and the whole Tonight Show debacle happened, of course. And he moved to TBS and did his show. And even through the Trump years, he stayed as far away from the political messaging as possible. Of course, there was many skits about Trump, but far less than any of the other shows. And he was able to mix in a lot of his trademark silly, goofy, broad comedy. And nowadays, he has left that talk show landscape entirely, doing the travel show for Max and his podcast, Conan O'Brien Needs a Friend. So he recognized that where the media landscape was going, and he adapted, and he's found more and more fans in recent years for that reason. You could also maybe say the same as Craig Ferguson. He hasn't really done much since then, but he at least got out of the talk show game before it became what it is today. Now, uh, nowadays there's so much competition for talk shows, right? Uh, on YouTube, for some reason, you can see clips of uh, The Late Show, Stephen Colbert, Jimmy Kimmel Live, and you will see them hit over 1 million views kind of right away. And I really don't know how that even happens because the ratings are lower than ever, and they're having to compete with everything on YouTube. Every kind of YouTube streamer, every comedian, every podcast, every anybody in the world who is making any kind of content for YouTube, they're having to compete with. Um, and that's why I would say that, people like to say that the talk show is dead, and that's really not the case because they're somehow just kind of barely alive. There's been changes in recent years, like cutting back on The Tonight Show, on how many shows they do, and there's been changes like that from the long history of those late night shows. It's like when Conan was fired from The Tonight Show is because he wouldn't accept, them changing the the programming block of The Tonight Show. And now so much has changed and been diminished and altered from its previous kind of tradition, there are a lot of reasons why talk shows are in the state they're in. But I want to point to where talk shows fit in the whole world of movie marketing. Okay, because as much as I love the talk shows, they are really just a product of kind of advertising. Because the network's creating a talk show, you do a few things at once. You fill up airtime, you have at least an hour. Decades past, initially, I think the Tonight Show was an hour and a half. You fill up a block of time with a comedy show that is right after the local news. Okay, and you have a monologue where they talk about the current events and the news throughout the day. You have a celebrity guest on, and they share stories from their life, and they be charming and funny and relatable, and they talk about the movie they just made. Now, more often than not, the movie they just made and are there to promote was produced by the same company that produces the talk show. So you create a show that is a vehicle for advertising, essentially, have the celebrity guest talk about the product they just made for that same parent company. Okay, they talk about the movie they just made, and then they show a clip. Movie star goes on the TV show, and they tell a story about making the movie. The host says, "Hey, we heard you brought a clip. Can you set up the clip for us? What's happening in this scene?" They show the clip. The talk show host says, "Oh, great! It's great having you here." The movie opens up this Friday. Go see it, folks. Cut to commercial, and you'll see a commercial for that same movie. And then you cut back to the show. There's a little bit of a comedy bit there, and then they'll have a second guest on. And the second guest will be less famous than the first, but they'll be doing, something where it's like from a TV show, from a new TV show on this same network. And talk about the show, maybe show a clip from the show, but usually when they cut to commercial break, you'll see a commercial for that show. And then at the end of the show, there'll be a musical guest. The musical guest, I would say more often than not as well, has a record that was produced by a record company, also affiliated, if not owned, by the parent company that makes the entire talk show. So the talk show, as much joy as it's brought me over the years, is a marketing scheme in some ways. Now, it's of course been written and hosted by incredibly talented people who are very funny and are just born entertainers. And as much as it pains me to see the talk show fade into irrelevancy, if not entirely die, um, that is sad, but it's also clear that that's no longer working. You know, a good example of this is Ellen. You know, when I was a kid growing up, like Ellen shows on every day. Everybody talked about how Ellen was so great, and everybody just loved her. And nowadays, you know, Ellen has been outed as an awful person, you know, in many ways. And Ellen did that same thing where she would have guests on the show partake in games and pranks and do silly things to humanize them, makes it more relatable. That's this thing that Jimmy Fallon has gotten a lot of hate for too. Back when he had his late night show in like the 2010s, like right after Conan left, he was doing a lot of those games. He was doing things that felt really different and fresh for the late night genre, and I loved it. I loved that show when he did it, and that's kind of become the norm for the late night talk shows that you have. You know, these celebrities come on and play games and just act silly, and then at the end talk about their new movie that they have out, and you get to feel like this movie star is relatable in some way. That's what it is now. And of course, you have the added bonus of making something viral. You know, a person doesn't have to watch the whole hour of a show. You know, late at night after the news, they can just watch, you know, a clip in the morning and talk about it at work. You know, it's like the carpool karaoke with James Corden. Now that I don't know how many people watched the show live on the air, but there were a lot of people sharing that on YouTube and commenting and liking and making some viral content there, you know. But the point is that we as an audience are much more discerning or savvy, if you will, that the old tricks don't apply anymore, and that the world of podcasts are vastly more effective than the late night talk show. Nobody cares if the most famous person in the world is on a talk show now. Maybe it's just because famous people are much more accessible than they used to be. You know, you could follow any major movie star, pop star, whoever on social media and know more about them versus decades ago. You would have to catch them on, you know, a talk show, and you could learn about them and see them be funny or charming or whatever it was, and, you know, just become a bigger fan of them. And nowadays, I feel like people realize how fake a lot of those things are, and the easiest way to know more about a public figure like that is to see them on a long-form podcast. I'm recording this just a couple days after the Ben Affleck podcast on Theo Vaughn came out. And the interview is very interesting, especially if you want to know kind of behind the scenes thing about how movies are directed and how they kind of come together. Theo Vaughn, of course, has now made a movie of his own. They were kind of discussing that. But at one point, you know, they talk about how, you know, movie marketing has really changed, and where he's on that podcast because that's where people go. That's what people watch. And the sight of seeing a movie star like Ben Affleck, who, by the way, I often say is my favorite actor. Ben Affleck is my favorite actor, honestly. Right? And so I was very excited to see him on there, and I like Theo Vaughn's show. But still, it's kind of startling to see a movie star of that magnitude, an Oscar-winning director, writer, actor, and Batman, be on Theo Vaughn's podcast. Something that started very small and grew over quite a number of years to become one of the most watched podcasts. But still, like to see it attract, you know, a star of that magnitude is pretty impressive, you know. And if you'll notice on Joe Rogan, the recent guests have been really really big. There's been a lot more Hollywood figures on there. Of course, he's had Post Malone on there a few times. Just recently, he had Mel Gibson on, who was promoting Flight Risk. Josh Brolin was on recently enough. So was Dennis Quaid. So there's been kind of really big movie stars on there. Woody Harrelson, Adam Sandler has been on there as well. So I think Hollywood is starting to recognize that you don't go on these talk shows anymore. You go on the podcast where people will actually be listening. And as something that was pointed out pretty heavily during the election, was that when Oregon had Trump on, when he had J.D. Vance on, you were able to see this politician talk for 3 hours uninterrupted. And you can get more of a sense of who somebody is. And the same goes for a movie star. You can be on a talk show like Jimmy Fallon and have prepared answers for, a 10-minute interview. And that's it. And people only really know what you want them to know about you. And that's it. When in a podcast, it's unexpected. It's unpredictable, rather. You can have answers prepared, but you don't know where the conversation is going to go. And that is what people want to see generally. That's another thing about the late night talk show, of course. Why has it been diminished so much? Largely because of politics, when you watch any talk show nowadays, it's about, the monologue is all about the political news of the day with a extremely one-sided perspective. You're seeing them talk all the MSNBC news throughout the day and present it in a form that is, a repackaged version of the news, presented as a comedy monologue, and that is just not interesting, and people don't want to see that. People don't want to see that, and they want some sort of level of authenticity. And I think slowly but surely Hollywood is starting to recognize that, and that marketing a film is harder than ever. To any independent filmmakers out there watching this, I'd be curious to how you market your independent film now. When I was marketing my documentary, I found it incredibly hard to get anyone, interested in the film. It's so hard to get anybody to pay attention to anything. Even the biggest budgeted Hollywood films have trouble attracting that audience these days. And your best shot is going on a podcast that people will listen to and trust the host at least, or enjoy the podcast, enjoy the comedy, versus something that is so rigidly prepared, something that is so predictable, and when you see a celebrity out there doing the rounds on podcast, or they're on the talk shows, or doing whatever, having an interview with Vanity Fair or something like that, what gets you excited about a new movie? Is there anything that a celebrity can do in their interviews to get you excited, or do you just have to see the trailer and think it looks like a great movie? I don't know. I don't know what the general audience is necessarily thinking, or exactly why something can get really big, or versus something that just doesn't. As a filmmaker myself, I want to understand how marketing works better, and I think looking back on everything now, it's a total overhaul of the system. I think that the old tools of marketing are no longer working. They're no longer working. And that's all I have for you today. Thank you guys so much for watching. And as always, if you do like these videos, if you like the show, let me know in the comments. Let me know. And specifically for this episode, let me know how you feel about this topic, how you feel about the late night talk shows. Do you watch any of them on a regular basis? Do you just watch a podcast. You watch anything, and what makes you interested enough to go out to the movie theater to see something. Is it just the trailer, or is it anything in the interviews? Let me know in the comments there. Also, of course, like the video. Subscribe so you don't miss any of our episodes. There's always movie reviews, shorts being posted, and yeah, a lot more coming soon. Thank you all for watching. We'll have a new episode every single Monday night. Thank you all. What a time to be alive.